Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Kevin Brushett from the Department of History at the Royal Military College of Canada, and welcome to my presentation, Global Justice Warriors, the Lost History of Cross-Partisan Canadian International Development Policy. This paper and presentation grew out of a study of Canadian development education movement that began in the mid-1970s, and I came across a 10-day tour by 3 Canadian MPs who set out to cross the country to assess Canadian support for international development and to try to sell them on the justice of a new international economic order that had been proposed by the Group of 77 at the UN General Assembly just a year prior. The tour grew out of work of the Parliamentary Subcommittee on International Development that was studying both CEDA's policies and programs, but also Canada's position on the NIEO. Those 3 MPs that you can see on the screen here were Andrew Bruen, Irene Pelletier, and Douglas Roche, although I will really only have time to talk about the latter. Bruen was a longtime CCF and NDP politician who represented the riding of Toronto Greenwood, and as the work of historians like Stephanie Bangarth have demonstrated, Bruen had long been a champion for human rights, internationalism, and humanitarianism, first in opposing the relocation of Japanese Canadians during World War II, and later as one of the leaders of Can-Air Relief that delivered food aid during the Civil War in Biafra. He also signed on to the Group of 78, a Canadian NGO formed in 1970 that sought to promote greater international cooperation through disarmament, equitable economic development, and a strong UN system. Bruen was the NDP's foreign and defense affairs critic for his entire parliamentary career. Less known is Pelletier, the Liberal member of the Tour Trio, who was born in St. Andre, New Brunswick. Pelletier eventually went on to earn a bachelor's degree at St. FX University in Nova Scotia, and then a PhD in political science at Toulouse in France, where his dissertation focused on Canadian aid policies towards the Third World. Pelletier represented the riding of Sherbrooke between 1972 and 1984, when he was defeated by future Quebec Premier Jean Charest. Pelletier only served 1 term on the International Development Subcommittee, and his role on the tour also appears to be rather slight, despite coming from the ruling party. Nearly all the news stories focus on the comments and critiques made by Bruen and by Douglas Roche. Now, Roche is the person I really want to concentrate on at the far left of this picture. He was not only the mastermind behind the tour, but largely the star of the show and the star of the International Development Subcommittee for most of the decade. Roche's politics and activism around development and disarmament were informed by his Catholic faith and the social justice precepts of Vatican II. Before entering Parliament as the member for Edmonton South in 1972, Roche had been a journalist with a range of Catholic Church publications, both in Canada and the United States. And it was there doing stories for the American Catholic Monthly Sign that Roche first traveled abroad to places like Nigeria and then later India, where he was sent to relate the stories of decolonization back to readers in the United States. And it was here that he discovered the grim reality of third world poverty. When Robert Stanfield, the conservative leader, came calling for Roche to enter politics in 1972, he found him as the editor of the Western Catholic Reporter, where he tackled controversial issues raised by Vatican II, such as family planning, global policy, drug and alcohol dependency, and race relations. Roche's first thoughts of the tour grew out of the three's attendance at the World Food Conference held in 1974, a conference at which Canadian NGOs attended in large number and also who took a particularly critical role towards the Canadian governments at the talks. The 3 members also attended the 7th UN General Assembly, where Canadian Secretary of State for External Affairs, Alan McEachran, first responded to the NIEO, and where Canadian NGOs such as GATFly were critical of Canada's half-hearted response. As such, then, the tour was to be more than just about platitudes, as Bruen noted. We will be trying, he said, to make the public more aware of the problems of starvation and injustice so that it will support the UN call for a new international economic order. All agreed that without a sustained program of public education to, quote unquote, vastly change the attitudes on the part of Canadian people, initiatives, they said, such as the NIEO could not be sustained. And so the objectives of the tour were to deliver 3 critical messages. 1, aid was no longer enough. 2, that the developed world's domination of the world's monetary and trade systems was actually worsening conditions in the third world. And 3, that the NIEO would ultimately strengthen the global economy by enabling lesser developed countries to become more self-reliant. Roche believed that while the 3 members did not always see eye to eye, they all agreed that the problems of global inequality and international development were so critically important that they transcended domestic cross-partisan politics. So what was then the NIEO? It was, as much as it proclaimed itself as new, it had been around since the early 1960s with the formation of UNCTAD and the Group of 77. Much of it was based on the Singer-Prebisch theory of underdevelopment, which postulated that third world nations had been purposely and historically underdeveloped as colonies of the developed world. In short, the NIEO was a plan to end the centuries-long plundering of their wealth and resources. In that sense, the NIEO also represented the most direct and sustained political challenge of the modern era to Northern or Western hegemony. Drawing on the example of OPEC, third world nations hoped that the industrialized world would make systemic concessions in return for greater economic stability. However, many of those Western nations were also worried about what they called OPEC syndrome. That is, the ability of other producers to form associations to regulate the prices and production of commodities from copper to bauxite to coffee, tea, and sugar. Led by the US, the group that eventually became the G7 sought to cure this OPEC syndrome by splitting apart OPEC and the LDC coalition, a result that had become painfully obvious by the time world leaders met again in Cancun to discuss North-South issues in 1981. Why then did it seem to catch on and dominate the politics of North-South relations for an entire decade? Well, there's two reasons. For one, the promise of the first development decade seems to have failed miserably. Planned modernization through large mega projects and bilateral aid had not only failed to deliver results, but it actually increased poverty and disenfranchisement within the third world. This frustration and disillusionment led to new thinking in the 1970s on international development that focused on redistribution rather than just macroeconomic growth. Poverty was more than just the lack of income. It was poor health, lack of education, malnutrition, but it was also political, as traditional development programs delivered benefits to third world elites, but little, if anything else, to the vast majority. Second, as disillusionment with the communist alternative grew in the 1970s, third worldism seemed to offer an alternative to the North Atlantic domination. It also seemed to capture the attention of what Paul Adler has called the NGO International, a network of ideologically left-leaning NGOs who came together in broad networks to challenge development policies that accelerated growing inequalities in the global economy. These groups came together to develop a worldview about poverty and economic growth that was based in concepts of social justice and that expressed a deep skepticism towards capitalism, but which at the same time did not promote status solutions to those problems. So what was Canada's position on the NIEO? Well, as Greg Donaghy's work demonstrates, the Trudeau government tried to broker a middle position between its industrialized G7 colleagues and the G77 group of LDCs that brought forward the declaration. Trudeau and other elements of his cabinet and the Department of External Affairs were concerned that unless the declaration was treated seriously, there would be greater North-South conflict. At the same time, the government recognized that many of the demands of the NIEO were antithetical to Canadian economic interests and would cause significant dislocations to the Canadian economy. These concerns were most forcefully expressed within the government by officials at International Trade and Commerce, as well as the Finance Department. And their opposition to significant trade-offs that Canada would have to make to align its trade policies with the declaration largely undermined Canada's response at the UNCTAD meetings in Nairobi in May of 1976. And as a result, then, both then and now, scholars have noted that Canada's position on the NIEO was one largely of grandiose rhetoric, but little substantive action on the policy front. Despite Trudeau's promises of nothing less than an acceptable distribution of the world's wealth, Canada's record, particularly in non-aid development measures, which made up the bulk of the NIEO, was both cautious and conservative. What then about Douglas Roche and a conservative approach then to IDA policies? Well, Roche was part of a generation of Red Tories who came to Ottawa under the leadership of Robert Stanfield. And that included people like Joe Clark, as you can see here, but also Flora MacDonald, for whom Roche would become her parliamentary secretary when she became Minister of External Affairs. But others, David MacDonald, John Fraser, Walter McLean, Jake Epp, could also be included in that crowd. As a Stanfield conservative, this meant dedication to the public interest and not to partisan interests. His commitment to development, disarmament, and human rights was built on what John Crosbie wrote in a letter to Roche, said was a uniquely Canadian conservative tradition founded on the principles of compassion, social responsibility, and respect for individual liberty. Indeed, there was fairly wide agreement within the party during the 70s that Canada should pursue an independent foreign policy and that its developmental assistance policies should be guided by humanitarian rather than ideological concerns. In a letter to Roche, Crosby fully agreed that in light of an increasingly interdependent world economy, it is difficult to view foreign aid simply as charity. According to Joe Clark, Roche was instrumental in creating a working relationship between the foreign policy community, including the NGO community, and the Tory party in the lead up to the 1979 election, despite some pretty deep ambivalences on both sides. In that vein, Clark made Roche responsible for the party's high-profile foreign policy conference in January 1979 that laid out much of its foreign policy commitments. For that reason, many in Canada's NGO community were actually shocked that Roche was not appointed to a higher profile foreign affairs position in the Clark government in 1979. That said, Roche did not campaign for a cabinet position and was not at all disappointed by Clark's choice of Flora MacDonald, nor her choice of priorities as minister, which were largely human rights and Canada's international development assistance policies. So what then were Roche's views on Canadian IDA policies? As David Morrison, the historian of CEDA, notes, this period was among the most challenging in CEDA's history, given the vigorous expansion of Canada's aid program that occurred over the 70s, as well as heightened North-South relations brought on by the NIEO. CEDA, as he notes, was highly attuned to shifting approaches to international development over this period and was generally a progressive force that supported innovative and creative ways of delivering its mandate. Nonetheless, the agency came under increased scrutiny as numerous scandals concerning mismanagement, failed projects brought the wrong kind of spotlight to the agency. As a result, CEDA spent a good chunk of its first decade firefighting the media and parliamentary scrutiny. One of those scrutineers was Roche, who was not shy to go after CEDA, but at the same time, he was also one of its staunchest supporters. For Roche, the key to Canada's IDA policy was the question of effectiveness. Too often, he claimed, CEDA's objectives were so, quote unquote, complicated, compromised, qualified, mumbled and jumbled, that it would be a minor miracle if we know if they worked. Too often, he also claimed that CEDA wound up charged with promoting anything we want to do for any reason as development. Roche believed that the only business CEDA should be in was in the development business. If ITNC wanted tied aid programs or external affairs wanted to spend money to win friends and influence friends, then let them. Otherwise, he claimed we were destroying the credibility and integrity of CEDA by playing this game. For that reason as well, he believed that CEDA needed to become a more powerful voice, buttressed with research and resources that could turn Canada's pious platitudes into effective policies. Roche was also an ardent supporter of Canadian international NGOs who provided what he called bottom-up rather than top-down aid. And he constantly challenged CEDA to direct more aid through Canadian NGOs such as CUSO and Oxfam, whose projects he claimed motivated people to take development into their own hands, rather than, he said, just transfer Western technology like the bulk of CEDA's bilateral aid projects. Roche's stance on the NIEO was also based on two important concepts. The first, obviously, as you could see from that first slide, was obviously social justice. But the second was the idea of interdependence, which was in many ways a kind of forerunner term of what we might now call globalization. This was the idea that peoples and nations of the world became linked in inextricable ways. Economically, this was linked to the notion that the development of the global north was linked directly to the underdevelopment of the global south. And Roche, who proclaimed to be a good conservative and support free enterprise, he also understood, though, that the system of free markets was not working and that it had been a contributing factor to the mass poverty felt throughout the world. On other occasions, he noted that global economic processes that benefited only the wealthiest minority or that maintained or increased the disparities between and within countries, he said, was not development, it was exploitation. He disparaged trickle-down economics as both unjust and illusory. He continually stressed that any new economic order must be based on more than just the acquisition of things. Development, he claimed, required a political, social, and economic order that would affirm and develop the dignity proper to every person. This, he claimed, was the full meaning of human liberation, perhaps presaging the message of development economist Amartya Sen's ideas in development and freedom by nearly 2 decades. In this way as well, Roche's ideas lined up alongside some of the more radical critiques of the global economy coming out of Canada's NGO community. Groups like GATFly, Oxfam noted that the NIEO was essentially a question of who shall benefit from and who shall control the world's natural resources. They also stressed that the control over the global economy had to shift away from the exclusive benefit of large transnational corporations whose success increasingly excluded third world peoples from the possibility of a decent and humane existence. Roche's ideas of interdependence were also fueled by a vision of what some have called spaceship Earth, the idea by the early 1970s that the Earth's resources and environment were finite. This was certainly the message of the Club of Rome's infamous limits to growth. However, Roche repeatedly poo-pooed these predictions, claiming that he had no faith in what he called the computer Cassandras. In this sense, Roche embraced what Victor McFarlane has called a vision of emancipatory interdependence, associated with many of the advocates of the NIEO. Roche believed that the NIEO's recognition of interdependency was not only the first step in both the third world and in Canada of societies free of poverty, exploitation, and social injustice, but was also a higher form of civilization that was well within our grasp. Now, despite being the front man for the party for most of the 1970s on international development policies, Roche's position in the party on these issues came under more concerted attack by the early 1980s. Part of this was due to the sharpening of Cold War tensions and the rise of neoconservatism under Thatcher and in particular Ronald Reagan, which encouraged a more hardline policy positions, particularly on disarmament and development. Roche was one of 4 Progressive Party members to stand against cruise missile testing in Canada. At the time, Roche lamented the rise of a new militarist fundamentalism, he called it, where the most vulnerable, the smallest, the weakest, and the poorest will suffer most. But he was most concerned with the influence of far-right groups like CFAR, Citizens for Foreign Aid Reform, led by neo-Nazi Paul Frum, on members of his own party. Frum and CFAR have been described as Nazis in suits for the way that they dressed up racism and intolerance in more respectable clothing. Now, Frum went after Roche and other Red Tories in the party as closet communists, whose internationalism was really a veiled belief in world government, and as such was a traitor to his party and also to Canada. We may want to think of them as kind of a John Birch Society North. Roche had no trouble publicly taking on Frum and his ideas, which he regularly denounced as outrageous, fundamentally wrong, and full of veiled racist innuendo. But he worried that Frum had gained the ear of too many of his cabinet colleagues, and he constantly went to Clark to complain about these freelancers in our party who are advocating positions that are opposed to the party position in the foreign policy community in Canada. As such, he believed that he was fighting a rearguard action against those who sought to undermine the credibility of the party to conduct Canada's foreign relations in what he called a sensitive and sensible manner. These hardline theologians, as he called them, such as Sinclair Stevens, had infected the caucus and had zeroed in on external affairs to push their agenda. Increasingly, many of them came to claim that Roche was not only masquerading as a conservative. He was an aberration who was distracted by foreign affairs and who wanted nothing else but to give Canada away to the third world. By the summer of 1982, Roche recognized his vulnerability to anger in the West, particularly within the Conservative Party in Alberta, and it meant that he was unlikely to be reelected. As someone who was never comfortable with partisan politics, Roche decided not to run again for federal office and to devote his time to disarmament. In that, he was rewarded by the Trudeau government when he became Canada's ambassador to the UN on disarmament. So what does this all say? Well, what does it say that one of the most knowledgeable, outspoken proponents of international development assistance from a social justice perspective came from the ranks of the Progressive Conservative Party? For good and for bad, there was once a broad middle ground in areas of Canadian foreign policy, particularly IDA policy, that at least in its ideals expressed a vision of what Cranford Pratt has once called humane internationalism. social justice was not always an epithet in conservative ranks. We can also see this then through the lens of the NIEO, which was the most widely discussed transnational government reform initiatives in the 1970s. It represented an alternative geopolitical future that captured the imagination of both those in the third world, but also a growing number of allies in the developed world, such as Roche. It was a concept of globalization that is in many ways so fundamentally different from what exists today that it is difficult to understand just how serious it was taken by politicians and policymakers across the political and ideological spectrum during the 1970s. The last issue that I think this raises as well is that Roche's rise and fall within the party should alert us to how quickly political change and transformation can occur. Though some of the ideas of neoliberalism had floated around for much of the period, the elections of Reagan, Thatcher, and perhaps in Canada with Mulroney gave impetus to a small hard right who had at that time been a minority within progressive conservative ranks. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.